Hello again. So I thought we could continue this discussion that I personally find very fun to have of art and musical creation and culture and blah blah through the decades or even centuries. And we're going to kind of touch upon the same theme, which is this how certain styles of art seem to be born. Now, in the last talk that I offered to the channel, I said that I was discussing how, war, for instance, the Vietnam War clearly gave rise directly to the creation of an amazing hippie artist. We would usually call him like Jimi Hendrix, a psychedelic artist, a peace and love sort of artist associated with the anti-Vietnam movement. And I also kind of discussed how the somewhat ironic thing about metal music is that it was created not during wartime, not by like a vicious empire, we most would say, but it was created during peacetime, in like suburban America, which is sort of weird. Like why was this really violent music suddenly created in suburbia? Okay, in the doldrums. But what I also thought is really interesting is something that's really I've pondered for many years, especially as a musician myself. See, when you're a musician, there's hot spots around the world where music is created and where it seems to flourish and where it's not created at all. So, for instance, if you listened to another video that I put up about Caravaggio, now we're going way back for a moment. You'll have to excuse me if you didn't listen to it. But I told the story of how the artist Caravaggio was making these magnificent paintings a long time ago in Italy in the late 1500s and the early 1600s. And Caravaggio had to go somewhere to get it done. He had to go to a specific city. And at that time, in his time, it was Rome. And why was Rome the hot spot for the painters and not some other random place? There's all sorts of giant factors that go into this. Rome was the hot spot then. But what's really interesting is that for as much as we claim and want to believe that the world today has totally changed and is nowhere near the same world as Caravaggio lived in centuries upon centuries ago, literally 400 plus years ago, there's actually many similarities when you start trying to create art. Because if I had gone to, say somehow or other, I just managed to go when I was 21 years old as a musician, maybe a bass player, to Berlin. Well, it would have deeply affected my musical creation and my output of what I might have created, because now I'm in Berlin, which is a city that has its whole own unique music scene. It has a very unique vibe going on, and the vibe in Berlin is definitely different than the vibe in New York City. And likewise, the vibe in the New York City scene is very different than the vibe in California, or for instance, where I live in this kind of middle of nowhere twilight zone. That's kind of where I consider myself living. And it's like, I think that in today's world, we don't really like to focus on this too much. This isn't really too much of a conversation anymore because I think it makes a lot of people really uncomfortable for some reason. We don't like to believe that certain places seem to be capable of actually creating really different things. But, of course, we can toss out some really simple examples, can't we? For instance, pretend it's 1962. And you're a guy who lives in Soviet Russia, and you want to create rock and roll music. Well, let's be honest, you're sort of shit out of luck, aren't you? Because if you want to create rock and roll music in 1962, there's a couple places you kind of are probably going to want to be. You're going to want to be maybe in London, in England, where the Rolling Stones and everything are about to explode, and the Beatles. Or maybe you're going to want to be in, what is it, Santa Monica, California. And yeah, maybe you can be in Miami, Florida. I mean, Miami now this is when you break it down to just the country, it's really funny because why didn't Miami have a giant hippie scene? Did it have one? Maybe it might have had some type of hippie scene, but when it was going on in California, most people who are really into the hippie songs of old times, they understand that this was a very much a Californian thing for some reason. And it was also very much a London thing. Well, Liverpool and stuff. But those British bands, it was very unique to Britain in a way and to California. And it happened kind of in New York City. But actually, in the 60s, for instance, New York City seems to have produced Mr. Dylan, who is certainly one of my favorites. But off the top of my head right now, I'm struggling actually to think of a great rock band that New York City would have produced in the 60s. The only example I can really give is the Velvet Underground. Because other than that, most of them really came from, like I said, they came from California. They came from, you had Crosby, Stills, and Nash, for instance, was one of the great hippie bands, came from California. You had the other one that did the Alice in Wonderland song. I always forget the band name. I always forget that band name because I didn't really listen to them a lot. Jefferson Airplane. That was the one. You had, of course, The Doors. Total Californian band. You couldn't be more Californian than Jim Morrison and The Doors. It was total, UCLA creation. It was a whole university thing that was going on there. They lived on Venice Beach in California. And then you had, sunshine and beaches. You had the Beach Boys in the 50s. Completely Californian. So even in the 50s, California was playing this kind of giant role that we often just kind of like to overlook, because when we're telling the history of it, we just go, yeah, these are great American bands. But actually, they came from a very specific spot of the United States. So, for instance, even if you were in Soviet Russia in 1962 and you wanted to come create rock music in the United States, you couldn't just pop up in fucking Wisconsin and hope to create a rock and roll band. You had to go to a specific destination. Right? You had to go somewhere specific. If you couldn't go there, you were probably fucked. Literally. And, I just think that's really curious. And why, the other question though, of course, is why didn't it happen in Soviet Russia in 1962? Why did they not create rock music? Everybody has a different opinion. Some people might say that without capitalism, rock music could have never been born. And that's why. That the problem was that the Soviet Union was communist. So because they were communists, they couldn't create rock. But that kind of goes to shit, that theory, because then you remember that lots of the hippies had serious communist sympathies. They almost identify as communists. So it doesn't really work. And then it's kind of is it the sun? Is it the fact that California is really sunny and warm and has that awesome Pacific Ocean and the beach? And maybe it's the fact that there's all those influences coming from Asia. Because in California, my sister was actually, I've never been to California still, unfortunately. I dream of it a lot. But my sister got to go a couple times now, and she was there for work a couple months ago, and she was actually in the great and the one and the only San Francisco. And she FaceTimed me while she was there, and I was sort of getting my little virtual view and tour of the city. And of course, it's full of these beautiful Asian influences. It has big-time Chinatowns. And Chinatown in San Francisco just looked so gorgeous to me as my sister was showing me it. And you realize that somehow or other, you don't really think of this, but that played a big role in the creation of the hippie too. Because actually all that was called transcendental meditation or whatever, and they were kind of into the Buddha, and they were into all that Zen shit. And so you see that was a very California thing, because it was coming from the Pacific Ocean. It was coming from the waves of influence that were coming just a little bit from Asia, and it kind of gets injected into the music. So you get this bizarre kind of collage, right? Collage of influence, where you get kind of like when you listen to the Doors, you're sort of getting like a Wild West Western where he's talking about bleeding to death in the desert, and he's talking about sort of all that. There's a kind of a dark cowboy Western feel to some of those Doors songs, but at the same time, you can hear the Zen, you can kind of hear that Buddha thing, you can hear, of course, the long hair hippie thing, you can hear all these influences, you can hear the beach, in a way. So all these things, it's crazy to think about this, how certain art comes to be born and how much it represents a time, as I say, and a fucking place. And then to stop and go, how come this didn't happen? Yet again, I ask. Here. Why didn't it happen in Soviet Union? Why didn't it happen in Canada? Right? Neil Young may be Canadian, but he had to split from Canada and get to California. And in fact, one of my favorite songs is by Neil Young talking about one of his first times seeing California. I can't remember the exact title of it. It's pretty amazing, though. I'm sorry that I can't remember the title. Let me see if I can look it up. It's just amazing because you can see that as a Canadian, like, he's finding California and he can't believe it. Where the hell is it? I don't know. I'll never find it. But, oh yeah, it's called Hitchhiker. Yeah, so it goes, when I was a hitchhiker on the road. Yeah, then came California, where I first saw open water. It was the land of opportunity. I knew I was getting hotter. And so he comes from Canada, but he has to get to Cali. So what's going on? Can anyone actually explain this? No, nobody can really explain it. We just know it's the case. There's something about that state. There's something about some of the towns and the cities in that state that over the decades literally now, has inspired incredible creation. And we also, of course, we know that something in New York City has inspired incredible creation too. We do know that. I mean, New York City gave us so much. It gave us the Ramones. It gave us Velvet Underground. It gave us a lot of stuff, it seems, mostly, though, in the 70s. Because, again, when you're looking at that 60s vibe, they didn't... New York City... That's the other... By the way, so before I digress and I get too confused, I'm sorry, it's really weird how at certain time periods, everybody latches on to something specific and even to a specific place. So as I say, in the 50s, like when I was growing up, my grandfather used to want to listen to music with me sometimes. And he had this is really before you were able to just get all the music on the internet, when I was about 10, 9. And I used to listen to a lot of his collection because I had no other choice. And my grandfather's collection was full of 50s records. So he had a lot of like Little Richard. He had Elvis, tons of Elvis. He had Beach Boys. Loved the Beach Boys. I saw the Beach Boys with him once. He loved that band. And it sounds sort of ridiculous, but when you're looking at 50s America, it's like the whole crowd, the whole mass of people, all the people in the country and, sort of the world at large, kind of randomly latch on to these surfer boys from California, to this sort of rockin' and rollin' white guy from Memphis, Tennessee. That's, of course, Elvis Presley. And then they latch on to kind of, that's kind of it. They latch on to like those two things. Rockin' white dude from down in Memphis who says, "Oh, shucks, yeah." And then they latch on to, I don't have a good Elvis impression. And then they latch on to the Beach Boys, these kind of like corny surfer boys, Little surfer, little one. They sang some great songs though, and that's what everyone latches on to. And then all of a sudden, that's the 60s. No New York City, nobody really, or the 50s, nobody really latches on. And then all of a sudden in the 60s, you see they latch on kind of again to Californians, and The South is almost, by the way, it's really funny. In the 60s, that whole Elvis Southern thing is just totally forgotten. Nobody even cares about it. Pop culture suddenly latches on hardcore to Britain in the 60s, and it latches on to California yet again. But this time, Californian thing has sort of evolved. Now it's become the long hair. Now it's not the nice, polite surfer boys like the Beach Boys. Now it's these long-haired freaks in a way. And they're all using strange drugs and shit like this. And then pop culture yet again transforms, and it's almost as if when you head into the 70s and you're heading into like the late 70s and the 80s and stuff, I think it kind of changes yet again, doesn't it? I mean, when I think, for instance, of the mid to late 80s, a lot of times if I think of who people started to like in rock music, you got like the Iron Maidens and everything, but you also have a band like Guns N' Roses. So yet again we see a Californian band. They're from California yet again. They're from literally straight out of LA. There ain't no San Francisco really in Guns N' Roses. The name implies violence, guns and roses. Guns and flowers. We're sort of a mix of violence and peace, right? And that's what they're sort of saying, I think. And they're sort of, we latch on to them, and we don't really know, like, do they represent anything? They seem to just sort of represent, like, going nuts and getting as drunk as you possibly can and, banging the drums or something as loud as you possibly can, and you kind of just freaking out, right? And having as much money, of course, as you possibly can. So they sort of represent their time, too, in their own way, but you don't really know. Does that mean as much as the hippies? We don't know. And then it switches, but they certainly kind of like, Slash is, believe it or not, originally from England or something, but like England is kind of totally forgotten too. I always remember read an interview once that the guy who started Led Zeppelin said, and Zeppelin of course was English, they were from England, and he was just sort of like, yeah, one day England, I don't know what happened. He was like, we just fell off the map. Like, Americans just stopped liking us. And it's true. Like, England was such a big deal in the late 60s and 70s. Everybody loved bands from England. They were like, they couldn't be beaten. You know what I'm saying? The Stones, the Beatles, The Who, Pink Floyd, every band you can think of, Black Sabbath, all of them were coming out of fucking England. The Kinks, I met her in a bar down in this, Lola. All these great bands, all out of England. And then all of a sudden one day it was like nobody even remembered England existed anymore. And Robert Plant sort of says that. He's like, yeah, England just sort of fell off the map one day. Like, Americans just forgot it. And everything then, you look at the 90s, you look at the 2000s, you look even at today's decade, and a lot of the times, you don't find England's influence too much anymore. You find it a little bit. I mean, I know Ed Sheeran's from England and stuff. But now you find it became very inward looking, I say. Inward means to say that, American fans seem to oftentimes only want to listen now, especially when I was a child. Everybody was really only strictly, the kids I grew up with often seemed to be strictly obsessed with American artists. And they spoke of American cities. They'd say, I like artists from Detroit, brah. And I like them from Atlanta and New York. And yeah, California and Los Angeles. But you never heard somebody who was like, dude, I only love bands that come from England. Nobody said that by the 2000s. But it was a very big thing for years. So it is sort of weird, like how that just sort of one day just collapses. Like, what happened? England in our time of the 2000s and the 2010s, again, there are some artists, but it started to be seen as very geeky. You ever notice that? So instead of being really cool and hip, England became geeky. It became like the land of Harry Potter and goofy glasses. And yeah, Ed Sheeran's a famous artist, but he's kind of a geek or something, right? So I think that's really weird how that happens. And this is totally inexplicable. Nobody has any idea why the perception shifted, why England one night in 1970 was the land of the hottest, sexiest rock stars who ever walked the fucking globe. Because if you ask a woman who lived back then who she thought the hottest dudes were, yeah, let's be frank, she thought they were fucking English rock star gods. Dudes from England. Yeah, mate, you know, I'm coming to America for me next fucking tour, bloke. You know, blah, 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 blah. Whatever they did, there's a little, you know. And now that's the height of geeks. They're geeks. But maybe they're considered geeks. But now go forward 20 years. England might just randomly pop up again. It could be that Russians. You never know where pop culture is going to decide is cool. That's the fun part about pop culture. No one has any clue where the fuck it's going to go next. So then, you know, it could suddenly be in 20 years that it's Russians. It could be. And I know a lot of people will be shitting their pants as they hear me say that. Because, well, how would that happen? But it could be the case. All it takes really is one really great artist, by the way, to create the thing. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, the Beatles just appeared and they overnight made England cool. And everyone else kind of rode on their coattails. Most of the British bands, if you watch interviews with the guys and stuff, they'll agree. They'll be like, oh yeah, mate, that, you know, if the Beatles had never happened first, you know, but really the Stones would have never have happened after. And, you know, of course, I was in the Who, and, you know, the Who would have never blown up if it hadn't been for Beatles first, and, you know, the Pink Floyd would have never have happened. And it was all really because it was the Beatles. They made English music cool. They made Englishmen sexy. And all the little American girls just couldn't wait to, you know, get with an Englishman. But then nowadays, like, we do see like Korean music. Notice that? That's coming in. So these trends just switch, and you never really know what direction they're going to go in next. And you never really can understand the other thing that I kind of started this stupid conversation about. You'll never understand what city on the planet is going to randomly give birth to the next really significant, cool, revolutionary art form. I think that is almost impossible to really predict. For example, to take it back to California, or even to take it back to London. So these days, when we talk about London creating these great bands, on some level, that sounds like maybe you could have predicted that at some point. Like, you could have been like, well, of course, dude. Like, London is a very significant city of the globe, and it has all this influence. And, you know, it's no surprise to me that amazing artists came from London in the 1960s music scene. But why not Paris or something? You ever wonder this? Like, why didn't the great rock bands come from Paris? Now, the first response is, well, it shouldn't be obvious why, because they didn't speak French. No one wanted to listen to French people. So, I mean, well, yeah, that's kind of true. But, you know, for centuries, Paris was considered the number one spot for where all the greatest art was going to come from. And if you look at rock music, it's like it doesn't play any role virtually at all. Except Jim Morrison dies there. Dies in Paris, one of the great rock stars. Jim couldn't wait to get out of America, I think, at the end. He had had enough. But, yeah, I don't know. You know, Paris, it's like how much of a role I love analyzing and trying to figure out the cities and the weird role that they played. So it's like, yeah, you know, Paris, how much role did it play? Or, you know, Rome. Rome had almost nothing to do with rock and roll. Just totally drops the ball. There's no influence. No one gives a fuck about it. Oh, and then, of course, you know, there's, again, to go back to the thing I was talking about in the first video, you got the questions of the war and who wins the war and everything. I mean, what happens literally if the Axis side won the World War, and what happens then? I mean, what happens in that world? Would any music have ever even existed? Good music? Or, yeah, just so many questions. And a lot of people would say they're worthless to ask, but I don't know. I mean, I remember I used to talk to this kid who was from Moldova, which is a country right near Russia. And you can look it up. They actually say right now that it's like potentially one of the countries that could end up invaded by Putin if he keeps going. There's always this fear that Putin's going to keep going. And, I don't know what the fuck he's going to do. But Moldova, like when I first met this dude, he was living in New York City. And he said, well, I'm from Moldova, and actually I'm going back, I think, because his immigration to America didn't really work out or something, he said. So he was going to go back to Moldova to live, and he lived in a city called Chizna. And me and him used to talk about this all the time, because he was really curious. And he used to say, I think he said, it used to be England, man, but I think the next big music scene, it's going to happen somewhere where no one is looking right now. He's like, it'll happen 35 years from now, and it's just going to be a country and a city that no one's even thinking of. Like, it's not going to be Paris, it's not going to be London, it isn't going to be fucking Berlin again, it's not going to be Los Angeles, dude. He used to say, it ain't going to be New York City again. It's going to be somewhere where no one's looking. Okay? And that's where you're going to see the next sort of revolutionary, brand new style of music, in this case, that captures the world. Maybe it'll be Korea. Maybe it could be in Cambodia. I mean, you just don't know. But don't forget, I mean, yeah, it's just strange. It's really, isn't it funny to consider these things? Where is it going to come from next? The other thing, though, to yet again go back to California, the other thing that I think is really fascinating about the whole California story is, whereas in the 60s, California became the music capital of the United States, now it's become the capital of video games. I find that really interesting, because video games are like the new music for a lot of these kids now. And it was sort of like California is kind of just always on this ball. And now, of course, it's the fact that it's going to go beyond video games, isn't it? And now they're saying that they're going to create this artificial intelligence and all this. And they're all operating in California. Those guys aren't working in New York City. They ain't in Manhattan making Chat GPT and stuff. They're all working in Cali. And all those problems are sort of, a lot of this stuff is problematic, especially for the Europeans. A lot of Europeans are getting really aggravated about all this because they don't run Amazon, they don't run Google, they don't run these major companies, and they're sort of wondering how they're going to fit in with the world going forward. And these are some mighty questions, which I can't answer. And I don't know if I necessarily believe that a corporation like Amazon is the best thing for the world. It's probably not. I also don't think it's too good for music's health. I think those, and even YouTube can go fuck itself, honestly. So yeah, these are just some. It's just, but there's still that ultimate curiosity. Why California? Why is all this stuff happening in California? How come they didn't create all this YouTube and shit and AI and ChatGPT in like Wisconsin or in Rhode Island or Maine, right? Why didn't they create the Doors in Maine?